close your eyes and drift back in time, past the noise of cities, past the hum of machines, to a world lit only by firelight. Somewhere in the silence of the Middle Ages, a hammer strikes against glowing iron, echoing through stone walls and smoky air. Each spark rises like a tiny star, vanishing into the dark. This story is not only about metal and men, but about patience, breath, and the quiet rhythm of endurance. Tonight, as you lie in bed, let the heartbeat of the forge lull you towards sleep and into another century. The forge was breathing. It sighed with heat and smoke, alive in a way that words could not describe. In a small stone hut on the edge of a medieval village, an old blacksmith stood before the open mouth of his furnace. Sparks lifted into the night like fireflies escaping a dream. His name was Edrich, though few bothered to remember it. What people did remember were the things his hands made: hinges that never broke gates that outlasted generations, nails that refused to rust even in the dampest storm. Edrich did not know the word chemistry. He knew rhythm, hammer, breath, pause. The pulse of his forge was the same as his own heartbeat. Each strike rang through the air like a bell announcing vespers. The iron beneath his hammer glowed orange, then red, then darkened into something permanent. It wasn't perfect. It was alive. When dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, the light found him bent over his anvil, whispering to the metal as if it could hear. "You will hold fast," he murmured. "You will not betray me." He wasn't praying to God, at least not entirely. He was praying to endurance itself, the invisible spirit that held iron together and somehow held him too. Outside, the world was soft and grey. The fields waited for spring, and smoke from a dozen cottages curled lazily into the sky. Inside, the forge burned on a stubborn sun that refused to rise or set. Edrich wiped the sweat from his brow, black with soot, and smiled faintly. He thought of his father, who had forged before him, and of the blacksmiths before that, a lineage of men who had learned to speak the same silent language: pressure, patience, and flame. No one in the village understood how his work endured. Their farm tools bent, their iron pots rusted through, but the hinges of the church door which Edrich had forged 40 years ago were still dark and smooth, singing softly when opened. Some called it luck. The priest said it was blessing. Edrich knew better. It was time. The secret was in not rushing the metal, letting it breathe, letting it cool like a sleeping child. He worked with charcoal, the kind made slowly in the woods behind the monastery. He never trusted coal. It burned too hot, too clean, too proud. Charcoal smoked gently, filling the forge with a sweet woody scent that clung to his clothes and hair. That smoke carried whispers of trees long gone now, lending their last breath to shape something that would outlive them. Sometimes travellers stopped by his forge. They would watch wide-eyed as the old man pounded the glowing iron with a rhythm that seemed ancient as thunder. "You work without rest," one said. Edrich only smiled. "I rest inside the work," he replied. They did not understand, but that was all right. Some things were meant to be felt, not explained. By evening, his arms trembled with exhaustion, yet his heart was calm. The iron cooled on the anvil, darkening into strength. He ran a calloused hand over its surface, feeling its quiet pulse. Every scar, every imperfection was a story, a memory of hammer and heat, of patience and error. In those flaws lay the secret of its endurance. When the church bell tolled across the valley, Edrich sat at the doorway of his forge. The horizon was painted with smoke and gold. Children ran by, chasing each other with wooden swords, their laughter thin and bright. He watched them and smiled, knowing the hinges on their homes and the gates to their barns would still be standing long after his own bones had turned to dust. He thought of the door he had built for the abbey, its great iron bands shaped by his hands, blackened and shining under centuries of prayer. Each pilgrim who pushed that door would touch a piece of him, not his name, not his face, but the endurance of his craft. That was enough. As night came, the forge dimmed to a low, glowing breath. The sound of metal cooling filled the air, a soft crackle, almost like sighing. Edrich leaned against the wall, eyes half closed, and listened. The forge was sleeping now, and soon so would he. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain, and the village dogs began to bark at nothing in particular. The world seemed to hush itself, settling into the same slow rhythm as the blacksmith's heart. For a moment, everything man, metal, and fire was perfectly aligned in silence. In that silence lay the lesson the old blacksmith had spent his life learning, that endurance is not a matter of strength, but of surrender. To last is to let go of haste, of pride, of the need to shine. Iron does not rush to become steel. It simply waits patient as the earth itself. So when you close your eyes tonight, imagine the glow of Edrich's forge still flickering somewhere in the dark. Picture the sparks drifting upward, turning into stars. Feel the warmth, the weight, the quiet promise that what is made with patience will not easily fade. And if this story has eased you into stillness, if it has warmed the corners of your mind the way a hearth warms a house, then let it stay with you. Before you drift fully into sleep, remember stories like this are the gentle forges of the soul. If you wish to hear more, to wander through old worlds and soft nights, subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, where the fire never dies and every tale is a doorway to rest. The night had passed quietly over the village. When dawn came, the forge where Edrich had worked all his life still breathed faintly, a soft ember behind the shutters. The hinges of the abbey's door gleamed under morning rain, as if remembering the warmth of his hands. Smoke rose thinly from the chimney, carrying with it the scent of charcoal, a perfume of patience that never left the valley. and somewhere not far away, another fire was being kindled, one that belonged not to mastery, but to learning. The story of the forge was not ending. It was beginning again in smaller hands. The boy woke before sunrise, his heart already listening for the sound of his master's hammer. In the grey stillness, the forge seemed asleep, the anvil covered with a cloth, the bellows folded like wings at rest. He tiptoed across the cold floor, stirring the ashes with a stick. Beneath them, a faint red pulse glowed the heart of yesterday's labour, still alive. He blew gently, and the ember brightened, exhaling smoke that curled upward like a ghost. "Easy," he whispered, as if speaking to a sleeping child. He added twigs, then a handful of charcoal. The ember took them slowly, tasting their carbon like food, and soon the small forge began to breathe again. Charcoal was not just fuel, it was the soul of fire, slow, patient, and alive with memory. The boy had heard Edric say that once in the quiet hours between work. "The wood remembers the forest," the old man had said, "and when it burns, it gives back everything it learned about the wind." Now, as the boy watched the smoke rise, he thought of those words. The scent was rich and earthy, not harsh like coal. It smelled like rain on bark, like time itself turning to breath. His master had taught him that charcoal burned differently from other fires. It did not roar, it whispered. It asked for attention, not force. When Edric entered the forge, the morning light caught his soot-black face and made him look carved from stone. "You've woken the fire," he said, not as praise, but as a quiet approval. He pressed the bellows and sparks leapt up, swirling like tiny stars. "Listen," he told the boy. "That's the sound of life air feeding flame. Never rush it. The fire must learn your rhythm." They worked together in silence. The boy pumped the bellows while Edric laid a bar of dull iron into the coals. Soon it glowed red, then orange, and the air shimmered with heat. Every breath of the bellows seemed to awaken a heartbeat inside the metal. "Watch carefully," the blacksmith said. "It's not about strength, it's about patience. The metal doesn't obey you, it listens to you. You ask it answers, but if you shout it, breaks." The hammer rose and fell. Each strike was deliberate, timed with the rhythm of the boy's breath. The sound filled the forge, steady, tender, and sure. The iron flattened and folded, the impurities sealed inside like secrets. When the boy's arms trembled from the bellows, Edric took over his movements, slow but unwavering. Outside, birds began to sing. Their voices mingled with the hiss of iron cooling in water. The boy watched steam curl into the air and felt for the first time that he was part of something older than himself, older than the village, older than the church. He was part of the quiet conversation between earth, air, fire, and time. "Master," he asked softly, "why do we use charcoal instead of the coal the traders bring?" Edric smiled without looking up. Because charcoal is honest, he said. Coal burns too fast. It makes the iron impatient. Charcoal keeps the flame human. It reminds us to take our time. The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He only knew that when he breathed the smoke of charcoal, something inside him slowed down. The world outside, the gossip, the hunger, the rain-soaked roads, all faded. Here in the forge, there was only rhythm. Hours passed like minutes. The metal took shape under Edric's hands, and the boy could almost feel it breathing with them. When they stopped, the old man set the finished hinge on the windowsill. Its surface shimmered with a dark silvery glow, as if it had absorbed the memory of every flame that had touched it. That said, Edric is the breath of charcoal. It doesn't just make the fire hotter, it teaches the metal to live. The boy touched the hinge and felt its warmth linger. Will it last forever? He asked. Nothing lasts forever, Edric said, but this will last longer than we will. That's all we can hope for. He looked toward the window where morning sunlight had begun to spread across the valley. Now, let it rest. Metal must rest, just like us. As the day wore on, they cleaned their tools, the scent of burnt wood hanging in the air like incense. The boy swept the ashes into a corner and noticed tiny glints of light buried among them, fragments of slag, glassy and black. They looked like stars fallen to earth. That evening, when Edric had gone home, the boy lingered. The forge was quiet now, but the coals still glowed faintly under a layer of ash. He knelt beside them, feeling their warmth on his face. He imagined the trees that had once stood tall in the forest, the axe that had felled them, the smoke that had risen as they turned to charcoal. It was as if everything in the world was part of one long breath. The forest exhaling into flame, the flame into iron, the iron into something that would hold for centuries. Outside, the rain began again, soft and unhurried. The boy closed the door, fed one last piece of charcoal into the forge, and watched it catch. The ember pulsed like a heart steady and calm. He thought of how his master had said that the forge never truly sleeps, it only dreams in embers. Perhaps people were the same. Maybe when they worked with care and patience, a part of them stayed alive in what they made, glowing quietly long after they were gone. He smiled, knowing that tomorrow would begin the same way, with silent smoke and the slow awakening of fire. The rhythm of the forge would continue just as it always had, and as the light faded, he whispered to the flame, "Thank you for breathing." The forge sighed in return, a soft sound like the earth exhaling. If this story has filled your mind with warmth and calm, let it stay with you tonight. And if you wish to wander again through ancient forges and sleeping fires, don't forget to subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories, where each tale glows quietly in the dark, waiting to keep you company until morning. The fire from Edric's forge burned for many more years, its glow reflected in the eyes of countless apprentices who learned to shape iron not by force, but by patience. Yet as centuries turned, that same philosophy travelled farther than the borders of his village. Across deserts and oceans in another world of heat and silence, a different kind of smith stood before a furnace that would make history breathe in metal. Where Edric's coals once whispered in the cold valleys of Europe, now the sun itself hammered the plains of India. There a single pillar waited to teach humanity what eternity truly meant. It stands in quiet defiance of time, a 7-meter column of iron rising from the courtyard of ancient Delhi, like a frozen beam of sunlight. The air around it hums with centuries of prayer. Monks, pilgrims, emperors, and wanderers have all laid hands upon its dark, smooth surface, marveling that it has never rusted, never crumbled, never surrendered to the weather or to age. The iron pillar was born not in haste, but in devotion. Long before the first cathedrals rose in Europe, Indian blacksmiths were already coaxing miracles from earth and flame. They had no laboratories, no instruments to measure purity, only the patience to listen to metal. Their furnaces were small mud brick chimneys built under the open sky, where wind and fire conspired to teach them balance. One can almost imagine the men with soot-black arms, faces shining with sweat, their hammers ringing through the dawn. They melted and shaped the ore piece by piece, layering each section as if building a prayer out of iron. Each strike sealed impurities inside, forging not perfection, but harmony, a metal so dense and kind to time that even the rain could not wound it. No one truly knows how they did it. Modern scientists have studied the pillar scraped at its surface, whispered equations to explain it. They say a thin layer of crystalline iron, phosphorus and oxygen formed over the centuries a natural armor called Missa White. But that word, elegant as it sounds, does not capture the wonder of it. The truth feels simpler and deeper. The makers did not chase perfection. They chased permanence, and permanence is always born from patience. There is a story told among the monks who live near the pillar. It says that when the smiths finished their work, they placed their hammers in the dust and bowed before the towering column. One of them whispered, "Let this stand as long as the heart of man remembers." They did not sign their names. They had already written themselves into the metal. When the sun rises over Delhi, its first light spills across the pillar like liquid gold. The air shimmers, and the iron seems to awaken. Tourists and locals approach quietly, touching the cool surface for luck, not knowing that beneath their palms lies a lesson in humility. For 1600 years, this iron has faced storms, monsoons and empires, yet it has endured because it was made slowly, because it was made with reverence. The iron's colour is not the red of decay, but a deep bronze black, smooth as river stone. When you touch it, it feels warm, even on cold mornings, as if it carries within it the memory of all the fires that once birthed it. There's a faint hum in the air around it, not a sound, but a feeling like the earth remembering its own heartbeat. Standing before it, one senses that the pillar is more than metal. It is a reminder of what happens when creation becomes an act of faith instead of ambition. Those who forged it did not measure time in minutes, but in generations. They built for eyes they would never meet. And so the pillar stands not as a monument to victory or power, but to patience. Some say the secret of its endurance lies in the soil rich with phosphorus, poor in sulfur, the perfect mix for immortality. Others say it lies in the slow, rhythmic folding of the metal, the gentle beating of iron under wooden hammers. But perhaps the secret lies not in the earth, nor in the technique, but in the hearts of those who refused to rush. They worked by the pace of breath, by the colour of flame, by intuition older than words. At night, when the courtyard empties and the last prayer fades, the pillar glows faintly under the moonlight. Bats sweep silently through the air, and the city beyond hums with distant life. The ancient iron stands still unbothered by the centuries. If you listen closely, you might hear it breathe a sound not of metal expanding, but of memory enduring. A legend claims that the pillar was once forged to honor a forgotten king who sought to touch the heavens. But the blacksmiths in their wisdom forged not a ladder, but an anchor. They gave humanity not the means to rise, but the strength to remain. Perhaps that is why, after kingdoms fell and languages vanished, the pillar still stands. It does not reach toward heaven. It keeps us rooted to earth. Every visitor who lays a hand upon its surface becomes part of its story. Some make wishes, others simply close their eyes. What they do not know is that the pillar has no need of prayers. It is a prayer. Its silence says everything: that beauty can be quiet, that strength can be gentle, that endurance is its own kind of grace. As the night deepens, the moon drifts above the courtyard, and the pillar catches its light. It gleams faintly, a dark mirror to the stars. If Edric, the old blacksmith from the distant valley, could see it, he would smile. He would understand that somewhere across the ages, other hands had learned the same truth, that fire does not create endurance. Love does. And perhaps, if you listen closely tonight, you'll hear the faint ringing of their hammers across time, echoing softly through your dreams. Let that sound lull you to sleep, the rhythm of patience, the song of metal that refuses to die. And if this tale has wrapped you gently in warmth and wonder, remember, there are more stories like this waiting beyond the firelight. Subscribe to Gentle Sleep Stories and let history whisper you to sleep again, one quiet miracle at a time. The Pillar of Delhi stood unmoved beneath the changing heavens. Seasons turned like pages and empires rose and fell around it, but the iron remained breathing quietly in the heat of India's sun. Yet far away in the western lands where cathedrals touched the sky, that same spirit of endurance lived on, in another form. There, iron was not raised as a monument, but built into the very bones of faith, in doors, hinges, and gates that sang when the wind passed through them. The song of the metal continued, changing only its language, never its meaning. If you ever walk through the great cathedrals of Europe, lift your eyes beyond the stained glass and carved stone. Look at the iron that holds it all together, the locks, the latches, the rails that frame the candles. They are dark as midnight, smooth as river rock, and older than the languages spoken around them. These pieces of iron have watched centuries unfold in silence. They have listened to prayers whispered through plague, war, and joy. In a small cathedral on the edge of the English countryside, Sister Beatrice often cleaned the iron gates before dawn. She was old now, her hands thin but steady, her fingers wrapped in cloth to keep away the chill. Every morning she polished the hinges with oil and beeswax, humming softly as she worked. To her this was not labour but devotion. Iron remembers, she used to say. It keeps the touch of every hand that ever leaned upon it. The gates before her were nearly 800 years old, forged by a blacksmith whose name had long been forgotten. Yet his spirit lived in the quiet gleam of the metal. The gate creaked when opened, not out of weakness but because it wanted to speak. Each sound was a story, every scratch a record of the souls who had passed through. Sister Beatrice would pause sometimes, her rag resting on the iron, and think of the hands, pilgrims, peasants, kings, who had all touched this same gate. Their prayers, she believed, had seeped into the metal itself, forming an invisible skin of faith. Perhaps that was why the iron had never truly rusted. It had been fed, century after century, by hope. When the morning light streamed through the rose window, the iron shimmered faintly, its dark surface glowing with the same quiet dignity as a monk's robe. It did not shine like gold or silver. Its beauty was humble, hidden in the strength of survival. It had been scarred, burned, and mended countless times, yet it endured not because it was flawless, but because it was loved. Outside the village, bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Mass. The sound mingled with the echo of Beatrice's song, rising gently into the vaulted ceiling. For a moment, it was easy to believe that the whole church was alive, breathing through its stone and metal bones. In her younger years, Beatrice had once asked the abbess why the iron gates were kept black, never painted gold like the altar. The abbess had smiled. Because, she said, iron teaches humility, gold boasts, iron serves. Those words stayed with her all her life. Now, as she rubbed oil into the iron, Beatrice thought of the old blacksmiths who had laboured in smoke and fire to make these pieces. She imagined them working by candlelight, hammering rhythm into metal, shaping faith without words. Each hinge, each bolt was a prayer made solid, a bridge between heaven and earth. Sometimes, when the church was empty, she would run her hand along the cold railings and whisper, "Thank you." Not to God this time, but to the hands that had come before, to the nameless craftsman who had built beauty from soot and sweat. In the evening, when the last candle was extinguished, the cathedral grew quiet again. The iron glowed faintly in the moonlight, filtering through stained glass, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. It seemed almost to breathe, as though remembering the rhythm of the forge that had birthed it centuries ago. Visitors came from faraway lands, admiring the architecture, the art, the relics, but few noticed the iron. It did not call attention to itself. It held up the heavy doors and bore the weight of the world in silence. There was something profoundly human about that, to serve quietly, to last without glory. On stormy nights when the wind howled through the cloisters, the iron gates would rattle softly, and Sister Beatrice would listen from her cell. She said it was the sound of angels testing the hinges, ensuring that faith still held firm. Others laughed at her superstition, but in her heart she knew it was true. The iron was alive in its own way. Centuries had passed since the days of Edric and his forge, yet the same fire lived here, the same stubborn patience, the same love of endurance. The monks who prayed, the smiths who forged, and the sisters who polished were all part of a long, unbroken chain of care. It was as if the world's endurance depended on their small, unnoticed acts. And so, when dawn broke once more, Beatrice stood before the iron gate and traced the pattern of its curls with her fingertips. She whispered the same prayer she had spoken every day for 50 years. May what is made by love never decay. Outside, the first visitors of the day crossed the churchyard, their shoes clicking softly against the stones. They would pass through the gate without knowing that they were touching 8 centuries of devotion. But that didn't matter. The iron would remember for them. In that quiet cathedral, the spirit of Edric's forge and the patience of the Delhi smiths had found a home. The fire had turned to faith, the hammer's rhythm to prayer. And somewhere deep within the iron's dark heart, there was still a soft, steady glow, not of heat, but of grace. So, when you next see an old iron gate, don't just pass it by. Touch it gently. Listen. You may hear the faintest echo of a forge that once roared with purpose of hands, that once shaped the soul of a world. And as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine the gates closing softly behind you, keeping the night safe and still. Let that sound, the whisper of hinges and the sigh of centuries, carry you gently toward sleep. The iron gates of the cathedral stood through countless seasons. Rain darkened their skin, snow softened their edges, and the hands of worshippers polished them smooth. Within the silence of stone and prayer time felt merciful, unhurried. Yet beyond those walls, the world was not so kind. In the narrow streets of medieval cities, life festered, and fear had a face small, quick, and silent. As bells tolled for mass, other sounds echoed through the alleys, the faint scratching beneath floorboards, the whisper of claws in the dark. The age of iron and faith was about to meet its opposite, the age of vermin and plague. He came before dawn, moving like a shadow through streets that still smelled of smoke and damp bread. His name was never the same from one town to another. Some called him Thomas, others the Catcher, others nothing at all. He carried a sack over one shoulder and a stick with a wire loop on the end. His boots were patched with old leather, and his coat hung heavy with the scent of ash, tallow, and death. Thomas was not welcome anywhere, yet everyone needed him. When he appeared, doors closed and curtains twitched, but after sunset, whispers came. "There's scratching in the walls," they said. "Come quietly. We'll pay in bread." And he would nod, saying little, already listening to the sound of his enemies. The rats were clever. They learned the rhythm of the streets, the smells of food and fear. They lived behind the beauty of the city, under churches, through sewers between the stones of mansions. Thomas knew their language better than he knew his own. He could hear them even when others could not. That faint rustle that meant a nest nearby, the sharp squeal of hunger, the silence that came before a swarm. He worked by instinct. A shake of flour on the floor showed him footprints by morning. A broken grain sack meant a colony. A cold hearth meant they had moved on. To catch rats was not just skill, it was patience, cunning, and a kind of grim compassion. "They are only trying to live," he muttered once to a child who watched him set a trap. "Same as us. But there can't be too many of one thing, or the world tips." When he set his traps, he whispered softly, as though bargaining. He used bits of salted fish, old cheese, sometimes the blood of a goose. Then he waited still as a statue until the silence broke. A snap, a squeal, a flurry of motion. He never flinched. The sound was both victory and sorrow. By midday, the city came alive again. Bakers opened shutters, merchants shouted, and children ran through the streets. Thomas walked among them unseen, his sack heavy with the proof of his work. He did not count how many he caught. The number didn't matter. By nightfall, they would return anyway. At the edge of the marketplace, he rested near a fountain. The water shimmered under a weak sun, and for a moment he forgot the smell of death. He watched pigeons flutter across the rooftops, free and foolish. A woman passed by her skirt, brushing against him, and he caught the faint scent of lavender soap. For an instant he remembered his wife long dead, and the small home they once shared before sickness took her. He had buried her with his own hands far from the city so the rats would not find her. When the plague came, it moved faster than even the rats. People whispered that it rode on their backs, carried by fleas invisible to the eye. Houses were locked, streets empty, bells You cannot catch what you cannot see. Still, he refused to flee. If I leave, he told a priest who begged him to go, who will keep them from your altar. The priest crossed himself, uncertain whether to bless or fear him. At night, the city glowed faintly with torchlight and fever. The dead were carried out by cart, their faces covered with linen. Thomas moved through the streets with his stick and sack, chasing life away from death. Sometimes in the corner of his eye, he thought he saw his wife again, standing in a doorway, smiling softly, her hands clean, her eyes kind. But when he turned, there was only smoke. People began to avoid him more than ever. They said the plague followed where he walked. Children threw stones. Once a group of men shouted, "You bring them here, you call them with your smell." He did not answer. They might have been right. His work made him part of what he fought. Days bled into weeks. His hands grew raw. His lungs burned from smoke, but he continued. He slept in alleys, ate scraps, and spoke to no one. Sometimes he thought the rats understood him. When he trapped one, it looked up with small black eyes that seemed almost human. "You and I," he whispered, "we're both cursed by hunger." Then he ended its life quickly, without cruelty. One morning, as the sun rose pale over the rooftops, Thomas stood in the square and looked around. The city was silent, too silent. No children laughing, no dogs barking, no bells ringing. The air felt hollow. The plague had taken nearly everyone. Only the rats remained, and him. He sat by the fountain again, the same spot where he once watched pigeons. His sack was empty, his traps rusted. He had won nothing. The world, it seemed, no longer needed his war. As dusk fell, he lay back against the stone edge of the fountain. The sky was the colour of iron, cooling after fire, soft grey, with a hint of red. He listened, waiting for the scratching he had heard all his life. But none came. The rats had moved on. For the first time, Thomas felt peace. Perhaps he whispered to the wind, "They've gone to build somewhere new." His eyes closed, and in his final breath, he thought he heard the faint sound of rain, gentle cleansing, forgiving. When morning came, the townsfolk who returned found him there, still and quiet, his stick beside him, his hands folded like a man in prayer. They buried him by the wall, far from the water, so the rats would not come. And in the nights that followed, when the city began to live again, no one spoke ill of him. They said only this, that once there was a man who listened to the silence and fought the darkness so others could sleep. If you listen very closely in the quiet before dawn, you might still hear the faint snap of his traps somewhere far away, a sound not of death, but of devotion. A reminder that even in filth and fear, there were those who worked for the world to breathe again. And now, as you rest, may his courage become your calm. Let the night settle softly around you like a quiet city, finally free of its noise. The city slept again, though not as before. After the plague's slow retreat, silence lingered like a ghost over the empty streets. The fountains no longer flowed as clear, the bells no longer rang as bright. Yet beneath the stillness, life began to return, timid footsteps, cautious whispers, and the smell of baking bread. The memory of Thomas the rat catcher lingered in every shadow. The people had survived, but something inside them had changed. And somewhere beyond the grave, perhaps Thomas was still listening to the faint scratching in the dark. His story did not end with death. It became the breath of every soul who dared to live again. Night returned slowly to the city, no longer an enemy, but not yet a friend. In the homes where candles once burned all night in fear, the flame was now allowed to die. The stars reclaimed the sky. But deep beneath the cobblestones, the darkness still remembered. There was a boy named Elias who had lived through the plague. He was not old enough to understand loss, only the emptiness it left behind. His father had died. His mother spoke less each day, and their house felt too large for two. Sometimes at night Elias would wake to a sound soft, almost musical, like the brushing of fingertips against wood. He would sit up and hold his breath, waiting. The sound came again, a faint scratching beneath the floor. The old fear returned like a forgotten dream. "They're back," he whispered to himself. But when he told his mother, she smiled sadly. "It's only the wind, my love. The world creaks when it's learning to live again." But Elias knew the sound was not wind. He had heard the stories of Thomas, the man who fought the rats and vanished with the plague. The children said that if you listened hard enough at night, you could still hear his traps snapping somewhere underground, guarding the city even in death. Elias wanted to believe that. He wanted to think that someone was still protecting them. One evening, when his mother fell asleep by the hearth, Elias took a small candle and crept into the cellar. The air was cold and dust hung like smoke. The candlelight trembled against the damp walls. He knelt, pressing his ear to the floor. The sound came clearer now, a steady rhythm like tiny drums. "Are you there?" he whispered. "Thomas." Of course, no one answered, but the scratching paused as if listening back. Elias's heart thumped hard. He wasn't afraid anymore. There was something oddly comforting in that sound, not the chaos of vermin, but the quiet persistence of life itself. Above him, the old cathedral bell began to toll. It was the first time he had heard it since the plague. The sound rolled through the streets deep and solemn. For months the bell had been silent out of respect for the dead. Now its return felt like a promise the city still had a pulse. That night, Elias dreamed of the rat catcher. He saw Thomas walking through empty streets, his stick glowing like a torch. But there were no rats now, only the shadows of them. They followed him not as enemies, but as companions whispering secrets only he could understand. Thomas looked at Elias and smiled faintly. "Don't fear the dark," he said. "It remembers the light." When Elias awoke, the candle had burned down to a pool of wax. The morning light crept through the cellar steps, soft and forgiving. He went outside and found the square alive again. Bakers shouting, children chasing each other, dogs barking with joy. The air smelled of bread and hope. Still in the quiet moments when the laughter faded and the wind brushed through the narrow streets, Elias could hear it again, the faint tapping beneath his feet. He began to think of it not as the sound of rats, but of memory, the echo of all who had worked, suffered and endured so that life might go on. Years passed. The city healed, though scars remained. People no longer whispered the name of the plague as if silence could bury it, but they spoke of Thomas as if he were a saint. In small chapels, candles were sometimes lit in his memory. A handful of coins left beside a trap was considered good luck. Elias grew older, and when he walked through the marketplace, he often stopped near the old fountain where Thomas had once rested. The stones were worn now, their edges rounded by time. He would touch the rim and close his eyes, imagining the weary man sitting there, his hands calloused, his gaze soft. You listened when no one else would, he whispered. Sometimes when night fell and the city grew quiet again, Elias would stand at his window and listen to the streets below. The sound was faint, but steady, like breathing a rhythm older than fear. And in those moments, he understood what Thomas had meant in his dream. The darkness wasn't something to fight. It was something to understand. He began to see the world as Thomas must have every creature, every echo, every silence as part of a larger harmony. Even the rats had their place, their hunger a mirror of humanity's own. Without them, the city might have forgotten what vigilance meant. One winter night, when the wind swept through the alleys and the moon glowed pale above the rooftops, Elias heard the scratching again, closer now beneath his own floor. He smiled and whispered into the dark, "It's all right, you can stay." Then he lay down, and the sound became a lullaby, steady and warm. The next morning he told his mother he had dreamed of Thomas again. He wasn't hunting anymore, Elias said. He was walking through a garden. There were no traps, no rats, only the sound of leaves. His mother smiled and kissed his forehead. "Then the world is healing," she said. That night, as Elias drifted toward sleep, he imagined Thomas's lantern shining deep underground, not to scare or to kill, but to guide a light that moved through the city's roots, reminding every hidden thing that it belonged to the same story. And in that dream, the sound of scratching faded into something else, the soft rhythm of a heartbeat, the pulse of a world still learning to be alive. So if you ever find yourself awake in the middle of the night and you hear a noise behind the walls, don't be afraid. It may not be a pest or a threat. It might just be the world remembering itself one heartbeat at a time, whispering that even after darkness, life continues to breathe. Let that thought comfort you now. Let it fill the room like a gentle hum. Close your eyes and listen. The sound of darkness is not silence, it's the quiet promise that morning always comes. The city healed slowly like a wound, learning how to breathe again. The bells that once tolled for death now sang for weddings. Markets filled with noise and laughter, and new children were born who had never seen the shadow of the plague. Yet for those who had lived through it, for Elias, for his mother, for the weary few who still remembered Thomas, life had changed forever. They had learned that darkness could speak, and that even silence carried meaning. But time with its patient hands kept moving forward, and as it always does, it began to call for another kind of watcher, another soul to stand between life and the fire that could so easily consume it. It was in the same century that the bells of faith began to sound again, that the first fire towers rose above the rooftops. They were tall and narrow, their stone faces streaked with soot and rain, built to hold one man at a time, a guardian of light, a sentinel against destruction. While others slept, he stayed awake. While others prayed, he watched. Matthias had climbed the tower steps every night for nearly 20 years. His knees ached, his hands were stiff from the cold, but he climbed anyway, carrying his lantern and the little loaf of bread that would last him until dawn. The climb was long, spiraling upward through shadow, each turn echoing the faint creak of wood and stone. When he reached the top, he opened the narrow window shutters and stepped into the wind. From up there, the city spread below him like a living map, its streets curling like ribbons, its chimneys breathing faint trails of smoke into the night. He could see the cathedral spire, the same one whose iron gates Sister Beatrice had tended all her life. And beyond that, 1,000 tiny points of light flickered each one, a hearth, a family, a fragile promise not to fade. The fire watcher's duty was simple to see before others saw, to sound the bell before the flames grew beyond mercy. He had saved the city 3 times, though few remembered. The first was a baker's chimney that spat sparks into a thatched roof. The second, a candle left burning near a tavern curtain. The third, lightning striking a stable filled with hay. Each time Matthias had rung the great bell before the flames devoured the street, and each time the people thanked him for a week, then forgot. He didn't mind. His purpose was not gratitude, it was vigilance. Tonight, as he stood on the tower, the air was cold enough to numb his fingers. He pressed them to the lantern's glass, feeling the faint warmth seep into his skin. The sky was clear, too clear, the stars sharp as pins. Below he could hear laughter from the taverns, the hum of music, the clatter of horse hooves. Life in all its careless joy. And yet he knew that within that joy lay danger. Fire loved joy. It hid in candles, in hearths, in lanterns, waiting for a breath too strong or a hand too slow. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon. To the north, the rooftops gleamed silver in the moonlight. To the south, the river moved like black glass. In the east, a cloud hung low, but there was no smoke. He exhaled, relieved. The night for now was safe. Sometimes he spoke aloud to the city, though no one could hear him. "Sleep well," he would say, his voice carried away by the wind. "I'll keep the watch." On lonely nights, he thought of the others who had watched before him, the nameless men who had stood in this same spot centuries ago, their eyes straining through fog and storm, ringing bells that saved lives they would never know. They were brothers in silence, bound by duty and by the endless rhythm of vigilance. At the base of the tower, a small chapel had been built where the wives of fire watchers came to pray. They prayed not for glory, but for mercy, that their husbands' eyes would not fail, that their hearts would not break under the weight of sleeplessness. Matthias's wife Clara had died years ago, taken by fever. Sometimes he thought he could still hear her voice in the wind that wrapped around the tower. "Be careful," it whispered. "You can't save everything." He would close his eyes and answer softly, "But I can try." The hours passed slowly. He ate a piece of his bread and drank from his flask. The city below was peaceful, but he could never let peace deceive him. Fire was patient too. Just after midnight, the wind shifted. It carried with it a faint, strange scent, not of bread or smoke or rain, but something darker. Burning oil. Matthias stiffened. He leaned out the window, scanning the rooftops, and there near the eastern quarter he saw it, a thin ribbon of smoke rising between the chimneys. His heart jolted. He grabbed the bell rope and pulled. The first clang echoed through the night, deep and trembling. Once, twice, 3 times. Then faster. The sound rolled across the city, breaking sleep, breaking silence. Below, lights flickered awake. Shouts rose. Buckets clattered. The people knew the code of the bell. Fire. Matthias rang until his arms ached. From his tower, he saw the flicker of flame burst to life, a roof catching a window glowing red. But he also saw movement lines of men and women forming chains from the well water, passing hand to hand, courage spreading faster than the fire itself. And in that moment, he felt something lift in his chest. This was why he watched. Not for himself, not even for the city, but for this, the moment when people remembered each other, when they became more than fear. Hours later, when the fire was finally beaten down and the bell grew still, Matthias sank to his knees. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his heart was calm. The city had survived another night. He looked out at the horizon where the first light of dawn was rising. The rooftops steamed from the rainwater thrown in battle against the flames. The air smelled of smoke and salvation. He whispered a prayer into the wind, one he had made himself long ago. May the night be watchful. May the fire stay humble. May the world remember to be kind. Then he sat in silence, watching as the sun climbed higher, warming the stones of the tower. Below, life began again. Bakers, children, merchants, unaware of how
close they had come to ruin. But that was as it should be. Matthias smiled faintly. He did not need them to remember his name. It was enough that the city still breathed.
And somewhere far below the streets, the ghosts of Thomas and Edric and all those who had endured before him seemed to stir their invisible hands resting on his shoulder, reminding him that endurance takes many shapes: a hammer, a trap, a bell. As the morning wind rose, he closed his eyes and listened to the quiet pulse of the waking world. To him, it sounded like forgiveness. The bell from Matthias's tower still echoed through the early dawn, as if the sound had chosen to linger long after the fire had died. Smoke curled softly above the rooftops, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. The city would soon forget the terror of the flames, just as it had forgotten Thomas the rat-catcher, or Edrich the blacksmith, or Sister Beatrice polishing her iron gate. But the sound of the bell remained not just in stone and air, but in the memory of those who had once stayed awake to keep others safe. In every age there would always be someone standing between night and ruin, someone who refused to close their eyes. The tower leaned slightly with age, its stones blackened by centuries of wind and rain. At its top, the room was barely large enough for a stool, a lantern, and the heart of a man. That man was Jonas, the new fire watcher, younger than Matthias, but already marked by solitude. His face bore the quiet of someone who listened more than he spoke. His hands, though calloused, moved with the gentleness of one who understood the power of small things, the turning of a key, the tending of a flame. He had taken over the watch after Matthias's death, climbing the same winding stairs, feeling the same wind through the same narrow window. On his first night, he found Matthias's old lantern still hanging from a nail in the wall. Inside it, the wick was trimmed, the glass spotless, as if waiting for another soul to keep the vigil. Jonas lit it with care. The flame flared, wavered, then steadied, filling the little room with golden breath. Outside, the city slept beneath a veil of moonlight. The rooftops glimmered like scales, the river flowed silently through the heart of it, and somewhere a dog barked, once, then fell quiet. Jonas rested his elbows on the window ledge and gazed at the maze of streets below. He thought of the countless lives moving unseen: bakers, midwives, beggars, children, all of them trusting that someone up here was watching, ready to ring the bell if danger came. It was a strange comfort, he thought, to be unseen yet necessary. The tower was both prison and sanctuary. In its isolation, he felt closer to the heartbeat of the world, to something vast and wordless that linked every breath, every flicker of flame. He remembered the story of Matthias, the man who had saved the city many times and died alone one dawn as the bell tower filled with light. They said his last words had been a prayer for mercy on those who never knew his name. Jonas often wondered if the city deserved such devotion. But each time he saw the glow of a hearth through a window or a candle flickering behind glass, He felt the same answer rise quietly inside him. Yes, it does. The night deepened. Clouds rolled across the stars like slow smoke. Jonas fed the lantern a little more oil and drew his cloak tighter. He listened to the distant hum of the river, to the creak of timbers, to the wind slipping between chimneys. The tower had its own music, a rhythm older than the city it guarded. Hours passed. He walked the small circle of the tower floor, his boots brushing the cold stone. On the wall hung a single brass bell, smaller than the great one below, but meant for the same purpose, warning. He touched it lightly, feeling the chill of metal seep into his skin. "Not tonight," he whispered, as if to promise it rest. Sometimes, when he grew tired, he spoke to the flame in his lantern. "Tell me," he said softly, "what keeps you alive?" The flame danced, answering in its own language of motion. "You burn," he continued, "but you do not rush. You take only what you need. You last because you listen to the air." He smiled at his own foolishness, yet in the stillness the words felt true. Near midnight the wind changed. It came from the north, sharp and cold, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, smoke. Jonas straightened. He leaned out of the window, scanning the rooftops. The streets below were dark and empty, but to the west, near the warehouse district, a faint orange glow flickered. His pulse quickened. He reached for the rope that hung from the ceiling, coiled like a sleeping serpent. With one firm pull, the bell above his head began to ring once, twice, then again, each note rolling through the night. The city stirred. Doors opened, shouts rose. People grabbed buckets, roused neighbors, and ran. From the tower, Jonas watched as the fire tried to take hold, a roof catching sparks, leaping to another. But he also saw the response men forming lines, women hauling water children, guiding the frightened horses away. The city, he thought, was like the iron of the old blacksmith, flawed, scarred, but stronger for its imperfection. The rain came at last, sweeping across the rooftops, hissing as it met the flames. Jonas kept ringing until the glow faded into smoke. Then, breathless and trembling, he sat down by the lantern. Its small flame flickered wildly in the draught, but did not go out. He placed his hands around it, steadying both the light and himself. When dawn came, the city was still. The smell of wet ash filled the air. Jonas leaned against the wall, exhausted but peaceful. Below, he could see people embracing, some weeping, some laughing. No one looked up at the tower, but that too felt right. The watcher's work was never about being seen. It was about seeing. He reached for Matthias's old journal, left behind in a drawer. Inside, the pages were filled with sketches of rooftops, notes about wind direction, prayers written in shaky handwriting. On the final page was a sentence that stopped Jonas's breath. "The fire never sleeps. and neither does love. He traced the words with his finger, feeling the truth of them settle deep inside. Love, like fire, was a dangerous grace. It could warm or destroy, illuminate or consume. To tend it was both burden and blessing. As the sun rose, he stepped to the window one last time and looked over the awakening city. The light caught the damp rooftops, turning them gold. Smoke drifted gently upward, mingling with the morning mist. He bowed his head, whispering the old watcher's prayer. May the night be watchful, and may the light never grow proud. Then, with a quiet sigh, he blew out the lantern. For now, the city was safe. The flame had done its work. But somewhere far below, in the echoing chambers of the past, in the blacksmith's forge, in the rat-catcher's alley, in the nun's chapel, and in every place where courage had once burned, the eternal light still glowed. It lived not in towers or temples, but in the human heart, that small, stubborn flame that refuses to die. The dawn after the fire was unlike any other. The city smelled of smoke and rain, but also of renewal. Windows opened cautiously, letting in air that tasted clean again. The people spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace the night had brought them. Jonas, the watcher of the tower, stood at his post one last time, his heart calm and full. He had rung the bell when it mattered, and the city had listened. But for every watcher there comes a day when the bell falls silent, when another must take up the vigil. The torch of endurance passed from blacksmith to sister, from rat-catcher to watcher, would soon find new hands. The fire had been conquered, but the memory of it lingered. Days later, ash still clung to windowsills like grey snow. Children traced patterns in it, while their mothers scolded, gently sweeping it away. The city seemed alive again, yet beneath its laughter was an unease, the quiet knowledge that what had been saved could easily be lost again. Jonas stayed in the tower, though the bell no longer rang. His body was weary, his beard streaked with silver that had not been there a year before. The townspeople thanked him with bread and wine, but he only nodded his gaze, drifting to the horizon. "It wasn't me," he said once to a merchant who tried to press a coin into his palm. "It was the city that saved itself." He meant it. From his high window he had seen something that night he could never forget, the way people moved together, the way strangers became brothers. It reminded him of fire itself, fierce, unpredictable, but also capable of creating light. Still, there were nights when sleep would not come. He would sit beside the cold lantern, watching the moon climb over the river, and remember the faces below. The young man who had climbed a burning roof to rescue a child. The women who formed a human chain to pass water from the well. The old priest who had refused to flee the church, praying until the flames bowed to the rain. Those memories glowed in him like embers. But so did another kind of fire, the fire of fear. For every life saved, others had been lost. He could still hear their cries when the wind howled through the tower cracks. Sometimes he wondered if vigilance could ever truly rest. One evening, a thick fog rolled in from the river.
muffling the world in silence. The city vanished beneath it, and only the tops of the tallest roofs peeked through like islands in a sea of grey. Jonas lit the lantern again, though he didn't need it for sight. He needed it for comfort.
He spoke softly to the flame as Matthias once had. "Tell me," he whispered, "how do you endure?" The flame flickered, shivered, and steadied. It seemed to breathe with him. Below, the fog thickened. Lights from the homes blurred, turning the streets into dreamscapes of gold and shadow. From somewhere in the distance came the faint crackle of wood. Jonas's heart tightened. He leaned out of the window listening. Then came the unmistakable sound, the low, hungry sigh of fire feeding on timber. "No," he breathed. "Not again." He grabbed the bell rope, but paused. The air outside the tower was strange, still heavy and without wind. The fire's voice grew louder, yet its light was dim, a ghostly shimmer beneath the fog. Jonas squinted, trying to see, and then he realized it wasn't a fire. It was the glow of torches moving in a line through the streets. Voices rose not in panic, but in anger. He could not make out the words, but their rhythm was violent like the pounding of drums. Shadows shifted below figures marching, carrying banners. It was not flame that threatened the city this time. It was men. Jonas's stomach turned. The night was thick with smoke and shouts with the echo of rage. The torches wove through the fog like serpents of fire. For the first time, the watcher understood that destruction did not always come from accident or storm. Sometimes it came from the hearts of men who had forgotten what it meant to protect one another. He wanted to ring the bell to call the city awake, but something inside him froze. Would they listen? Would they even understand what danger he was warning of? Fire could be fought with water, but hatred had no such remedy. He stood there, hand on the rope, heart pounding. Below, the torches scattered, some toward the square, others toward the riverfront. A distant crash followed the splintering of wood, the shattering of glass. Screams rose and fell like gusts of wind. Jonas gritted his teeth and pulled the rope. The bell roared to life, its deep notes cutting through the fog. 1, 2, 3, the rhythm of warning. The sound carried over rooftops and alleys, stirring the city from sleep. Doors opened, windows slammed, voices shouted. Fire, someone cried, though they could not yet see it. But when the people ran into the streets with buckets and blankets, they did not find flames. They found neighbors shouting at one another, strangers accusing strangers, fear spilling into violence. And yet, in that chaos, the bell kept ringing, steady, relentless, reminding them of something older, something sacred. Jonas rang until his hands bled. The bell's echo became his heartbeat. Below, the crowd began to break apart. The torches dimmed. Shouts turned to murmurs. Someone began to pray aloud, their voice trembling but strong. The words spread like ripples in water. The anger thinned, replaced by exhaustion, by shame, by silence. When the bell finally stopped, the city lay hushed once more. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the damaged broken windows, a few burned carts, but no lives lost. Jonas sank to his knees beside the rope, his chest heaving. The tower floor was cold beneath him, but he felt warmth on his cheeks. Tears he hadn't known were falling. He looked out at the horizon, where dawn was beginning to rise, pale and uncertain. The city below was scarred, but still standing. It wasn't the fire, he murmured. It was the fear. As the first light touched the tower, Jonas realized the truth. Matthias must have known, and Edric before him, and Thomas before them all, that watching over others is not about preventing destruction. It is about preserving hope. Fire, disease, hatred, they were all the same trial, wearing different faces. And yet, humanity, stubborn and shining, kept surviving. He turned back to the lantern. Its flame burned low, trembling, almost gone. Jonas cupped it gently in his hands and whispered, "Rest now. The city will remember." Outside, the smoke drifted away. The bell stood silent, its echo fading into the morning air. But somewhere deep within the stone it still hummed a low, steady heartbeat, the sound of endurance itself. And if one listened closely from the streets below, they could almost hear the whisper carried on the wind. Keep watch. Always. The fog that had swallowed the city drifted away with the coming dawn, leaving behind a world washed in pale gold. Jonas descended the tower for the first time in many days, his legs stiff, his heart heavy but calm. The streets were quiet again, though the scent of smoke and rain still lingered. Windows creaked open, faces appeared tired but alive. Life, it seemed, always found a way back. As Jonas walked through the square, people greeted him softly, some with tears, some with silent gratitude. Yet he only nodded. The bell above would ring again one day, but it would not be his hand that pulled the rope. The time had come for another to keep watch, for the world never runs out of nights that need guarding. Years passed and the old tower remained. Its stones darkened with age, its bell rusted, but it still stood like a sentinel against the sky. The city around it changed, new streets, new bridges, new faces. Fires came and went, storms rose and fell, and yet the tower endured. It was no longer manned by a single watcher, but by many. The city council had turned the duty into a guild, a brotherhood of firekeepers, each sworn to protect the city as Matthias and Jonas once had. At sunset, they climbed the narrow stairway in pairs, carrying lanterns that flickered in the wind. Their uniforms were plain, thick wool coats, leather gloves, caps that bore no rank. They were all equal before the flame. The oldest of them, a man named Otto, often told the younger ones that to watch was not simply to look, but to love. You must love the city as a mother loves her child, he said. You must see its weakness and forgive it, see its danger and still believe in it. Among the youngest was a boy named Lucien, no older than 16, who had joined the guild after his home burned in a market fire. His father had been a baker, his mother a seamstress. When the flames took their shop, it was Jonas's bell that had saved their lives. Though they had lost everything, Lucian never forgot the sound, that deep trembling note calling them out of their sleep. He said it sounded like mercy. Now, as a watcher himself, Lucien stood at the window of the tower, gazing over the same rooftops Jonas once guarded. The world below was brighter now. Street lamps lined the cobblestones, chimneys puffed softly, and people laughed in the taverns. Yet, even in that brightness, Lucien knew how quickly darkness could return. He had seen it in his own home. The fire watcher's nights were long filled with silence and patience. Some read by candlelight, others prayed, others simply listened to the wind. When storms rolled in, they braced against the cold, scanning the city for that first thread of smoke. Their eyes learned the language of flame, how it started as a whisper before turning into a scream. One night, Lucien asked Otto, "Do you ever grow tired of watching?" The old man smiled, his eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. "No," he said, "you don't tire of watching when you understand what you're protecting. We are not keeping fire away, we are keeping life safe long enough to burn brighter." Lucien pondered that for a long time. There was wisdom in those words, the same kind that seemed to echo from the very stones of the tower. Every watcher felt it a sense that the building itself carried memory, that its walls remembered every hand that had rung the bell, every night that had been saved from ruin. Sometimes in the still hours before dawn, the watchers heard things they could not explain. A faint hum in the stone, the whisper of footsteps when no one was there. Once Lucien swore he heard a voice low and kind, murmuring a prayer he did not know. He turned, but the tower was empty. The flame in his lantern flickered softly like it recognized the sound. Otto said the tower was haunted by those who had watched before. Not with ghosts, he added, but with gratitude. Lucien believed him. It comforted him to think that Matthias, Jonas, and all the others might still be here keeping company with the living. Sometimes when the wind shifted, he thought he heard the faint ringing of the old bell, though it had not been used in years. The guild grew over time. The watchers built smaller towers around the city, each one lit by a single lamp at night. From above, the city looked like a constellation fallen to earth, tiny stars burning in the dark, each tended by a human heart. But no tower was as revered as the first. It had become a place of pilgrimage. Newly sworn watchers would climb its steps at dawn, lay a hand on the bell, and whisper their vow, "I will see before others see. I will wake before others wake. I will love what others forget." Lucien's hands trembled the first time he made that vow. He felt the cool metal beneath his palm, the weight of countless promises made before his own. And in that moment, he understood watching was not a burden. It was a form of prayer. To
To stay awake while others slept was to believe that the world was still worth saving. Years later, when Lucien himself grew grey and his steps slowed, he trained new watchers, just as Otto had trained him. On his last night in the tower, he sat alone by the window and looked out at the sleeping city. He saw the soft light of hundreds of hearths, the shimmer of the river, and the faint glow of other towers standing watch. He smiled. The bell above had long since cracked and could no longer ring, but Lucien didn't need its sound to feel its presence.
The silence itself had become the new language of vigilance, a peace earned by centuries of endurance. As dawn rose, painting the sky with pale pink and gold, Lucien whispered a final prayer, the same one passed down from Matthias and Jonas. May the night be watchful, may the light be humble, may the heart endure. Then he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of sunrise wash over him. The tower's flame flickered once as if bowing farewell, and then steadied ready for the next keeper, the next watcher, the next heartbeat of the city. And so the chain continued, unbroken and unseen, stretching through time like a golden thread woven by hands that refused to rest. The iron of Edric, the courage of Thomas, the faith of Beatrice, the vigilance of Matthias and Jonas, all of it lived on here in the quiet towers and the hearts of those who kept the light. And when night returned, as it always would, someone would be there awake, patient, listening. Someone who remembered that to watch was to love, and that love, when tended like a flame, could outlast the dark. The city that once depended on its watchtowers eventually outgrew them. The bell that had guarded generations fell silent for good, its rusted tongue resting against cold iron. But the memory of those who had watched Jonas, Matthias, Lucien lived on in whispers and stories. Parents told their children about the keepers of light who never slept, and how they once saved the world from burning. Centuries passed, and though the faces changed and the fires dimmed, the spirit of vigilance endured. Across an ocean and an age, that same spirit would find itself reborn in a land of wide skies and restless winds, where the hum of engines replaced the sound of church bells, and where hope, though disguised, still had the same heartbeat. In the vast plains of the American frontier, the air carried a different kind of stillness. It was the stillness of distance, of horizon, of a world that seemed too large for its people. The year was 1885, and Dodge City lay like a scar across the Kansas dust, loud by day, lonely by night. Wooden sidewalks groaned under boots and wagon wheels. The air smelled of smoke leather and the sweet rot of spilled whiskey. The fire watchtowers of the old world had long since become stories, but the same hands that once rang bells now swung hammers, built saloons, and nailed signs for railroads. Men came here chasing fortune or forgetting something they couldn't bury. The churches stood small and quiet,
dwarfed by the noise of guns and card games. Yet even in this wilderness of dust and sin, a spark of endurance still glowed, not in towers now, but in hearts that refused to break.
Among the scattered lights of Dodge, one small building flickered faintly at the edge of the street, a bakery owned by a woman named Nora. She was not old, but her eyes carried the weight of 100 sleepless nights. Every morning before dawn, she lit her oven, the flames licking at the darkness, and filled the air with the smell of bread. Her customers were cowhands and wanderers, gamblers and lawmen, all grateful for something warm in their hands before the long day began. Nora rarely spoke. Her husband had died years earlier in a mining accident out west, leaving her with nothing but debts and a single loaf of bread from the day before he left. That bread had hardened to stone over time, and she kept it on a shelf, not as a relic of grief, but as a reminder that even the hardest things could endure. Outside Dodge City woke with its usual noise, the clang of horseshoes, the shouts from the saloon, the distant cry of a train whistle. But inside the bakery, time slowed. The air shimmered with heat, and the rhythmic sound of Nora's kneading became a quiet prayer. Each loaf she shaped seemed to carry a fragment of her own strength, as if the fire within the oven was the same one that once burned in the forges of old Europe. Across the street, an old man named Samuel swept the front of the general store. He was nearly 80, though he moved with the stubborn precision of someone who refused to let age win. People called him the janitor of Dodge, but he had once been a soldier, a builder, and a dreamer. Now he spent his days keeping dust from burying the past. Every morning as the first sun touched the rooftops, Samuel would tip his hat toward Nora's bakery. She would nod in return, a silent ritual between two souls who had survived too much to need words. One evening, a storm rolled in from the prairie. The sky turned green and bruised the air thick with electricity. The wind howled down Main Street, snatching hats and scattering papers. Nora hurried to close her shutters, but she saw Samuel still outside trying to tie down a loose awning. "Samuel," she called through the rain. "Leave it." He looked up, smiling faintly through the downpour. "Somebody's got to keep the place together," he shouted back. Then the wind tore the awning free, sending it crashing to the ground. Nora ran out into the storm, her dress whipping around her legs. Together they dragged the canvas aside and took shelter under the store's porch, laughing breathlessly like children caught in mischief. When the worst of it passed, they sat in silence, listening to the rain on the wooden roof. The storm had knocked out several oil lamps, and the street lay in near darkness, save for the soft golden glow from Nora's bakery window. Samuel watched it flicker and said quietly, "That light of yours, it keeps this town alive." Nora shook her head. "It's just fire," she replied. He smiled. "No, it's hope disguised as fire." "Same thing that built every church and saved every soul that ever believed in tomorrow." His words hung in the air like a hymn. Nora looked at the bakery window, the warmth spilling across the wet street, and thought of the generations before, of the hands that had forged iron, caught rats, polished gates, and watched towers. They had all guarded the same fragile flame she now tended in her oven. The form had changed, but the calling was the same. When the storm cleared, the air smelled of wet wood and earth. The stars returned faint and cold above the prairie. Samuel stood leaning on his broom and said good night. Nora watched him go, his shadow merging with the lamplight. Then she turned back to her bakery, opened the oven, and felt the heat kiss her face. The loaves inside had risen perfectly golden and full. She smiled for the first time in months. That night she left one loaf on the windowsill for whoever might be hungry before dawn, a stranger, a wanderer, maybe even someone who had lost their way. In Dodge City, mercy was a rare luxury, but she offered it quietly without fanfare, the way a candle offers its light. And as the wind whispered through the empty streets, it seemed to carry the voices of the past. Edric's hammer, Thomas's traps, Beatrice's hymns, Matthias's bell. Their echoes mingled with the crackle of Nora's fire, bridging centuries with a single truth: the world survives because someone somewhere keeps the light burning. In the stillness before sleep, she thought of that and whispered, "Let it burn, Lord, but let it never consume." Then she blew out her lantern, the bread still warm on the windowsill, and the town of Dodge rested beneath the steady watch of a baker's humble flame. The storm that swept through Dodge City left behind a silence deeper than before. Puddles mirrored the first stars, and the wooden sidewalks gleamed under the moonlight like wet bones. The next morning, the sun returned with soft forgiveness, drying the streets, brightening the town, and bringing the smell of freshly baked bread from Nora's bakery. The little flame she had guarded through the night still burned steady and warm. Samuel passed by as usual, tipping his hat with a smile that said everything without words. Yet even as peace returned, Nora sensed a strange unease, a quiet loneliness that settled in the corners of her heart, the kind that comes when one realizes the light they keep alive is often for others, not themselves. As dusk painted the prairie sky in shades of violet and rose, the other side of Dodge City began to stir. Where Nora's bakery glowed with warmth and bread, another kind of light awakened red, flickering through dusty windows and cheap lace curtains. Down in the narrow street, locals called Paradise Row women stepped out of their doorways into the evening air, their perfume mingling with the scent of whiskey and rain-damp earth. They were called many names: soiled doves, painted ladies, fallen women. But behind the rouge and silk, they were simply women who had learned how to survive in a world built by men and softened only by their laughter. They came from everywhere: Ohio, Louisiana, Ireland, Mexico, all chasing hope, until Her hair, once red, had faded to copper under years of smoke and gaslight. She walked through the rooms with the grace of a queen in exile, ensuring every lamp was trimmed, every curtain tied, every girl safe. "Don't call me madam," she used to tell newcomers. "Call me keeper. I keep you safe, I keep you fed, and I keep the peace." Kitty had built her world brick by brick, not from pride, but from necessity. The men of Dodge could pretend not to see her by daylight, but they depended on her by night. The money from her house kept half the town running, from the bartender's wages to the preacher's charity box. Yet she asked for nothing except one rule: no cruelty under her roof. "There's already enough outside," she'd say. One evening, as the lamps were being lit, Nora stepped out of her bakery to deliver a basket of bread. She walked past Paradise Row, head bowed, pretending not to notice the laughter spilling from the windows. But one voice caught her ear, low, tired, almost breaking. She stopped. Inside, a young woman sat on the steps, her dress torn at the hem, her hands covering her face. Without thinking, Nora approached. "Are you hurt?" she asked. The girl looked up, startled. Her eyes were blue and bright beneath smudged makeup. "Just tired," she whispered. "Too many nights." Nora handed her the basket. "Here, eat while it's warm." The girl hesitated, then took a piece, tearing it gently. "You're the baker," she said softly. "I know your bread. It smells like Sunday mornings." Nora smiled faintly. "And you? What's your name?" May, the girl replied. "Just May." Behind them, Kitty appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "You'd better get inside, May," she said, then turned to Nora with a polite nod. "You've got a good heart, miss, but hearts don't last long on this street." "Maybe not," Nora said, "but bread does." That night, as Nora returned home, she couldn't shake the image of May's face, so young, so tired, yet somehow still gentle. She thought of how each woman on that street lived like a candle in the wind, burning for others until nothing remained. A week later, the storm returned, not of rain, but of men. A drunken cowboy, furious over a lost game, stormed down Paradise Row with a torch, shouting names no one should ever say. By the time the sheriff arrived, the fire had spread to 2 buildings. Nora saw the glow from her bakery and ran toward it, wind whipping her skirt, heart pounding. People were already shouting, forming chains to carry water. And among them, she saw Kitty, her face streaked with soot, dragging one of her girls from the burning doorway. "Get back!" someone yelled, but Kitty only laughed, coughing. "I've stood in worse flames than this." Nora threw her shawl over her head and ran in beside her. Together they carried buckets, tore down curtains, and pushed through the smoke. Inside, the silver parlour. May was trapped near the stairs, hem caught on a nail. Kitty reached her first, pulling her free, while Nora threw water on the growing flames. By the time dawn broke, the fire was gone, and so was the parlour. The red lights that had once glowed like sin were now only ashes, grey and soft. But no lives were lost. The women stood in the street, wrapped in blankets, faces streaked with tears and smoke. Nora handed out bread to each of them, one piece at a time. No one spoke for a long while. Then Kitty looked at her and said quietly, "You saved us." Nora shook her head. "You saved yourselves. I just brought what I could carry." The sun rose higher, gilding the ruins in light. It was strange how beautiful the ashes looked. They shimmered like silver dust, as if the night had burned away not just the buildings, but the shame that clung to them. Later that day, the townspeople began to rebuild, and Nora opened her bakery door wide. The women from Paradise Row came one by one to help knead dough, sweep floors, wash dishes. For the first time, laughter filled the air, not as performance, but as peace. Kitty stood behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her voice soft. "Guess we're all bakers now," she said. Nora smiled. "No, just keepers of the light." And as the ovens glowed once more, the whole town smelled of bread and redemption, the scent of something being born from ruin. That night, long after the last loaf had cooled, Nora stepped outside. The sky above Dodge City was clear again, the stars steady, unblinking. She looked toward where the parlor had stood and whispered, "Let the fire burn what it must, but never what is good." Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried, and the wind carried the sound across the plains like a lullaby. And for the first time, Dodge City, wild, restless, wounded, slept in peace, cradled by the quiet hands of its women keepers of every humble flame that had ever dared to shine. The ashes of Paradise Row cooled slowly beneath the Kansas sun. Days turned into weeks, and though the scent of smoke faded, its memory lingered in the hearts of those who had survived. Nora's bakery became more than a shop. It became a refuge. The women who once lived by the red lights now came at dawn, their laughter mingling with the scent of yeast and cinnamon. Each loaf they baked seemed to reclaim a piece of dignity the world had stolen from them. But peace, like bread, could not last without tending. Beyond the laughter, there were wounds that no oven heat could heal, memories that flickered like coals waiting to spark again. And at the center of it all stood Kitty Malone, the woman who had once ruled the night and now stood face to face with her own ghosts. Kitty Malone had never believed in saints, though she had spent her life hearing their names whispered by priests and gamblers alike. She believed in work in survival, in keeping one's word. Yet now, standing in Nora's bakery with flour dusting her sleeves, she felt closer to heaven than she ever had in her gilded rooms of velvet and mirrors. The women called her Madam, still out of habit more than respect. But when she turned to correct them, the word caught in her throat. Perhaps she was still a madam, not of sin now, but of second chances. Each morning she arrived before sunrise to stoke the oven's fire. The crackle of wood, the glow of embers, it reminded her of the light that once burned behind her curtains. But this flame was different. It did not destroy, it transformed. She would sit beside it, watching the women knead, dough brush, egg wash, hum hymns they had half forgotten. They were rebuilding their souls one loaf at a time. Sometimes, when no one was watching, Kitty whispered the names of those who hadn't made it out of the fire. The nameless girls. The ones buried in unmarked graves beyond the town's edge. You were not lost, she would murmur to the rising bread. You were light misunderstood, unseen, but still light. Nora noticed how Kitty's hands trembled when she worked near the flames. One morning, as the sun spilled through the bakery window, she poured 2 cups of coffee and said softly, "You can stop coming every day, you know. You've done enough." Kitty looked up, a faint smile crossing her tired face. "If I stop," she said, "I'll start remembering too much." Nora didn't argue. She understood that kind of remembering, the kind that burned more than any fire. As the weeks passed, word spread beyond Dodge City about the women who had turned ruin into redemption. Travelers stopped by the bakery not just for bread, but to see the miracle for themselves, the once fallen women now working in light. Some came to mock, others to marvel, but most left with tears in their eyes. They called it the House of Rising Bread, and though Nora hated the name Kitty, secretly loved it. One evening, as the last loaves cooled on the shelves, a stranger entered. He was a priest, older than Kitty remembered priests being, with kind eyes and a worn satchel. "Miss Malone," he said gently, "I knew you once long ago, in New Orleans." She froze. "Then you knew me before I fell. I knew you when you were trying not to." He smiled faintly. "We all fall, Kitty. Some just learn how to rise differently." She looked at him for a long moment, the air between them thick with the scent of bread and forgiveness. "Why are you here?" she asked finally. "To see what God can do with ashes," he replied, "and to tell you that the names you whisper, they are not forgotten. Mercy remembers what memory cannot." That night, Kitty couldn't sleep. She walked alone to the edge of town where the prairie met the stars. The wind moved through the grass like the breath of old prayers. She knelt, pressing her palms into the soil, and whispered again the names of the lost May, Clara Ruth, and others whose faces had long faded from her mind. She didn't ask for forgiveness this time. She gave thanks. When she returned at dawn, Nora was already in the bakery shaping dough. Kitty joined her in silence. The 2 women worked side by side, their movements slow, rhythmic, almost holy. When the first batch of bread came out of the oven, Kitty broke a piece and handed it to Nora. "For them," she said. They ate in silence, the bread still warm, the taste simple and perfect. It was the first time Kitty had eaten something she herself had made since she was a girl. For a moment, she felt as though the years had fallen away, leaving only the woman she might have been. As the morning crowd gathered, a young boy entered one of the orphans who slept behind the saloon. He stood at the counter, hat in hand, staring at the loaves with wide eyes. Nora smiled and offered him one. "Go on," she said. It's on the house. The boy hesitated, then pointed toward Kitty. That lady already gave me one yesterday, he said. Nora turned, surprised. Kitty only shrugged. Old habits, she said softly. Can't stop keeping the strays fed. After the boy left, Nora laughed quietly. You'll make a saint yet. Kitty shook her head. No saints in Dodge City, Nora. Only sinners who learn to share their fire. Outside, the day began to unfold, the whistle of the morning train, the clatter of hooves, the hum of a world that had no idea what miracles it held. Inside the bakery, the women worked together in harmony, their laughter rising like music over the sound of kneading. Later, when the ovens cooled and the last customers drifted away, Nora found Kitty sitting by the fire staring into the embers. "What will you do now?" Nora asked. Kitty smiled, her eyes reflecting the glow. "I'll keep watch," she said. "Not from towers or windows, but from here. Someone's got to make sure the light stays." As night fell, Nora locked the door, leaving a single candle burning in the window, the same way she had left bread for strangers. The flame flickered gently against the glass, a promise that even in a town once known for its shadows, light could find a home. And somewhere beyond the prairie where the stars hung close and bright, the wind carried the scent of warm bread, and with it the quiet prayer of a woman who had finally forgiven herself. The candle in Nora's window burned through the night, its small flame swaying gently against the wind. Kitty sat beside it until dawn, her eyes half closed, her heart strangely calm. The bakery was quiet, except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock and the distant cry of a train leaving Dodge. When morning came, the world outside seemed clean again, as if the rain that fell overnight had washed away more than dust. But in the still air of that fragile peace, Nora sensed something shifting the calm that comes before another trial. For in life, even light must be tested by fire to prove its truth. The day began softly with the smell of coffee and bread. The women moved through the bakery in easy rhythm, their voices low and cheerful. Kitty was humming an old Irish tune while shaping dough. Her sleeves rolled up her hair loose for once. Nora watched her and thought how strange it was that the same woman who once ruled the red light street now looked like someone's mother. Strength, she realized, had many faces, some hidden, some scarred, all beautiful. By late afternoon, the sky turned the color of pewter. Clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and low, and the air grew thick with the promise of rain. A restless wind pushed through the open door, scattering flour across the counter like pale snow. "Storm's coming again," Kitty murmured, glancing toward the window. Nora nodded. "We'll close early tonight." But just as they were preparing to shutter the windows, Samuel burst through the door. His hat dripped rainwater onto the floor, and his face was pale beneath the grime of years. "The church tower's been struck," he said breathlessly. Lightning hit the steeple fires climbing fast. The words struck the room like a bell. The women froze, every memory of the parlour's fire flashing before their eyes. Nora grabbed her shawl. "We'll help," she said simply. Kitty wiped her hands on her apron and followed without a word. Outside, the sky roared. Sheets of rain poured over the town, but the wind drove the flames higher. The church stood on a hill at the edge of Dodge, its steeple blazing against the dark clouds, the old iron bell glowing red in the heat. Townspeople ran with buckets, their shouts drowned by the storm. When Nora and Kitty arrived, smoke billowed through the cracked doors. The priest, Father Callahan, stood coughing at the entrance, his hands blackened with soot. "Everyone's out," he rasped, "but the bell, if it falls, the roof will go with it." Kitty looked up at the burning tower. Through the smoke, she could just see the massive bell swaying dangerously on its beam. "We need to cut it loose," she said. "Let it fall before it brings the whole place down." "No one can get up there," the priest replied. "The stairs are burning." But Nora was already moving. She tied her shawl over her mouth and ran toward the side door where the narrow stairwell began. Kitty caught her arm. "You can't go in there alone." "Then come with me," Nora said, her eyes steady. And so they went, two women who had faced fire before climbing through smoke and flame once more. The heat was suffocating the air alive with the roar of burning timber. The old stairs groaned beneath their weight. Every step was a prayer. At the top, they found the bell still hanging, its bronze surface glowing like a star. The beam above it was split and trembling. Through the haze, Nora saw a length of rope still tied to the bell's lever.
"If we pull it," she shouted, "it'll swing free."
Kitty coughed hard, waving the smoke away.
"Then let's do it."
Together they grasped the rope. Their hands burned as they pulled, muscles straining, lungs aching. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder, the beam cracked and the bell tore free. It plunged through the burning air, smashing through the wooden floor below and landing in the nave with a crash that shook the earth. The flames, robbed of their anchor, began to die down as rain poured through the gaping hole in the roof. The women staggered back down the stairs, coughing and trembling. When they reached the door, the townsfolk surrounded them, pulling them into the open air. The storm washed over their faces, cooling the burns on their hands. The fire was out. The bell lay silent in the ruins, blackened but whole. Father Callahan fell to his knees in the mud, tears mixing with the rain. "God sent you," he whispered. Kitty laughed softly, her voice hoarse. "God sent two stubborn women who don't know when to quit." Later, as the town gathered to pray among the ashes, Nora and Kitty stood apart, watching the smoke drift upward. The bell, though darkened, had not cracked. It gleamed faintly in the lightning's afterglow, like iron remembering its birth in the forge. "Do you hear it?" Kitty said quietly. "Hear what?" Nora asked. "The silence," she replied. "It's like the world holding its breath, waiting to begin again."
The rain eased, turning to a soft drizzle. Children ran barefoot through the puddles, their laughter echoing through the broken doors. For all its ruin, the church still stood, its walls firm, its cross leaning but unfallen. The people of Dodge would rebuild it brick by brick, the same way they had rebuilt themselves. That evening, Nora returned to the bakery with her clothes still damp. She lit a single candle and placed it by the window, the same way she always did.
The flame wavered, reflected in the wet glass. Kitty joined her bandaged hands resting on the counter.
"Do you ever think the fire will stop testing us?" she asked. Nora smiled faintly. "Maybe the fire isn't a test," she said. "Maybe it's the teacher." They sat together in silence, the scent of wet earth drifting through the open window. Outside, the rain had finally stopped and the clouds began to part. From somewhere in the distance came the faint toll of the church bell, not a warning this time, but a benediction. Its sound rolled through the night, deep and tender, as if thanking them both. Kitty closed her eyes and whispered, "For once it doesn't sound like sorrow." Nora nodded. "No," she said softly, "it sounds like peace." The bell continued to ring, its voice carrying far across the prairie, through fields and rivers, through silence and memory.
And as its echo faded into the night, the women of Dodge City bakers, keepers, sinners and saints knew in their hearts that light once shared could never truly be lost. That night, under a sky cleansed by rain, the town slept soundly, held together by the gentle rhythm of the bell and the soft glow of a single candle, proof that from ashes and pain grace could still rise, warm as bread, steadfast as love, eternal as fire, tamed by faith. The bell of the church had rung long into the night, its deep voice echoing across the wet plains until it became one with the wind. The townspeople of Dodge slept beneath its lingering sound, their dreams softened by the knowledge that they had been spared. The morning came quietly, washed clean and pale. The air smelled of earth and rain, of ashes that had turned to forgiveness. Nora woke before dawn as always to light the bakery's fire. As she watched the first sparks catch, she thought of Kitty beside her in the church the night before, of courage born not from pride, but from love. The fire crackled warm and alive. It no longer felt like a test. It felt like a promise kept. When the sun rose over Dodge City that morning, it painted the rooftops gold, as if heaven itself had descended for a moment to rest upon the earth. The town stirred slowly, shopkeepers opening shutters, children running barefoot through puddles, Samuel sweeping the porch of the general store. The bell that had survived the fire lay in the church courtyard, now blackened, but shining faintly in the light. People came to touch it, not to mourn, but to remember. Nora carried a basket of fresh loaves to the church steps. The air was still cool, and her hands were wrapped in linen against the morning chill. Kitty met her there, her fingers bandaged, but steady. "You didn't have to bake so early," she said. Nora smiled.
habit," she replied. "Besides, I like to think that bread keeps the heart awake." Kitty laughed softly. "Then maybe I should eat more of it." They sat together on the steps as the town came to life.
Father Callahan knelt near the fallen bell, tracing the soot marks on its side like sacred wounds. A group of children played nearby, tossing pebbles that clinked against the metal and rang like tiny echoes of its former voice. Each sound felt like a heartbeat, a quiet reminder that even silence could sing when touched by life. As the day warmed, townsfolk gathered to rebuild. Men brought lumber, women carried water and stones, and even the smallest children picked nails out of the ashes. The work was slow, but filled with laughter. Dodge City, so often known for its noise and vice, had found something purer in its hardship unity. Nora and Kitty helped where they could, patching wounds, passing bread, offering rest. Between them, a deep understanding grew, something like kinship, but older, quieter, the bond of two women who had both walked through flame and chosen to stay kind. In the afternoon, the sky brightened to a tender blue, and the wind carried the smell of wheat from the far fields. Nora stood outside the bakery, her apron dusted white, watching the people move like a single living body. "It's strange," she murmured. "How much good can come from fire?" Kitty, standing beside her, nodded. "Maybe fire just shows us what was always there. The strength, the love, the will to endure." As evening came, the rebuilt church walls rose higher. The bell had been cleaned and polished, though Father Callahan decided it should remain on the ground, a monument to what was overcome. "It's no less holy here," he said. "It rings now, only in the heart." That night, as the townspeople gathered for prayer, Nora stood in the back with Kitty and Samuel. The church was lit by dozens of candles, their light flickering across the new wood beams. The scent of wax and smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of Nora's bread. Father Callahan spoke simply, his voice soft but certain. "Every age has its keepers of the light," he said. "Those who stay when others flee, those who rebuild when others despair. They are the hands of God moving quietly among us." As his words settled over the room, Nora looked around and saw those hands everywhere, scarred, trembling strong. The hands that had baked, carried, fought, and rebuilt. The hands that had wiped tears and soot, held children, and lifted beams. These were the hands that had shaped the town's soul. After the prayer, people lingered in the quiet. Kitty stood beside the bell, her reflection faint on its dark surface. "I used to think I had nothing left to give," she said. "But maybe keeping faith alive is enough." Nora rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's more than enough," she said gently. "You've taught us all how to keep the fire without letting it burn us." Kitty smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then maybe, just maybe, I've done something right in this life." Later, when the crowd dispersed and the moon rose full above the prairie, Nora walked home through the hushed streets. The bakery stood waiting, warm light glowing through its window. She opened the door, the scent of bread greeting her like an embrace. The ovens were cooling their embers soft and steady. She touched the old wooden counter where so many lives had found comfort, and for a moment she closed her eyes. In that silence, she felt the presence of those who had come before Edrich at his forge, Thomas with his traps, Sister Beatrice polishing her iron gates, Matthias ringing his bell, Jonas watching the rooftops, Lucien training the next watchers. She saw their faces in the flicker of the flame, their courage in the glow of the oven. Across centuries and continents, their work had been the same: to endure, to protect, to keep the world from falling into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, she whispered a quiet prayer. May the fire stay kind, may the light never fade, and may these hands, though tired, never stop creating good. Outside, the stars shimmered like distant sparks scattered across the heavens. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called its cry, soft and lonely, yet strangely comforting. The wind rustled through the wheat beyond the town, carrying with it the faint echo of the bell, no longer a warning, but a song. In that moment, Nora understood what all those who had come before her had learned, that endurance is not about strength or perfection. It is about gentleness that refuses to die, love that keeps working even when no one watches, and faith that continues to glow long after the world grows cold. As the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, she sat by the window with the fresh loaf cooling beside her. The candle still burned its flame, small but unwavering. She watched it flicker and smiled. It had survived every storm, every night, every sorrow. And as the morning light began to grow, the flame seemed to bow, merging with the new day, proof that all light, when tended with care, becomes one. And so the story of the hands that endured came to rest, not in grand cathedrals or towers of stone, but in the simplest of places, in a bakery at the edge of a forgotten town, where two women kept the world warm with nothing more than faith, fire, and love.